1 penny. That's all that stood between Eliza Moore and starvation. 1 copper coin she didn't have. In the harsh winter of 1887, in a dying mining town where mercy was rarer than gold, a widowed woman's dignity hung by a thread thinner than the worn fabric of her only dress. But when her trembling hand couldn't produce that final cent, a stranger's quiet intervention would set in motion a love story that would defy every rule of charity, pride, and the unforgiving frontier. This is the story of how the smallest kindness became the greatest love. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to like and comment with your city so we can see how far this story travels across the world. The November wind cut through Silveridge like a miner's pickaxe through stone, sharp, unforgiving, and cold enough to make bones ache. Eliza Moore pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the threshold of Harrison's general store, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Through the frost-glazed window, she could see the warm glow of the pot-bellied stove inside, and beyond it, the shelves lined with goods that might as well have been displayed behind iron bars. She had counted the coins 17 times that morning, 4 pennies, 2 nickels, and 1 precious dime, 24 cents total. Enough for a loaf of bread, the day-old kind that Mr. Harrison sold for 23 cents when he was feeling charitable. It had to be enough. It was all she had left in the world. The door's bell chimed as she pushed inside, and the warmth hit her face like a blessing she didn't deserve. 3 other customers occupied the store, 2 miners still dusted with rock powder from the morning shift, and a rancher she'd seen around town but never spoken to. All 3 turned to look at her entrance, and Eliza felt the weight of their gazes like stones in her pockets. She'd been in Silveridge for 8 months now, ever since Thomas died in the cave-in that had taken 11 men and whatever hope this town had left. The other widows had family to return to, money saved up, somewhere else to go. Eliza had nothing but the small room above the seamstress shop that Mrs. Chen let her occupy in exchange for mending work, when there was mending work to be had. In a dying town, even sewing was a luxury few could afford. Mrs. Moore. Mr. Harrison's greeting was neutral, neither warm nor cold. He was a businessman, after all, and business in Silveridge was dying along with the silver veins that had birthed the town. "What can I do for you today?" Eliza approached the counter with as much dignity as she could muster, her worn boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The miners had gone back to their conversation, but she could feel the rancher's eyes still on her, a steady presence at the back of the store. "The day-old bread, please, Mr. Harrison." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Small mercies. The shopkeeper reached beneath the counter and produced a loaf wrapped in brown paper. It was smaller than she remembered, and her heart sank a little, but she kept her expression neutral. Pride was free, and it was about all she had left to spend. "That'll be 25 cents today, I'm afraid." Harrison's tone carried a note of apology, but business was business. "Flour prices went up again. Can't sell it for less without taking a loss myself." 25 cents. 2 pennies more than she had. 2 pennies might as well have been $200. Eliza's hand tightened around the coins in her pocket. She could feel their edges pressing into her palm, could hear them clink together with a sound that suddenly seemed very loud in the quiet store. Behind her, the miners' conversation had stopped. The rancher had gone silent too. Everyone was listening now, waiting to see what the widow would do. She could ask for credit. The thought made her stomach clench with humiliation, but she could ask, except she already owed Mrs. Chen 2 weeks' rent, and the Chinese woman's patience, while remarkable, wasn't infinite. Taking on more debt seemed like stepping into quicksand. The more you struggled, the faster you sank. "I have 24 cents, Eliza said quietly, placing the coins on the counter one by one. They made small clicking sounds against the wood, each one a tiny declaration of her failure. "Perhaps I could pay the difference next week. I'm expecting payment for some mending work." It was a lie. There was no mending work expected, but lies and pride often walked hand in hand when hunger was involved. Harrison's weathered face creased with something that might have been sympathy, but his head was already shaking before she finished speaking. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Moore. I truly am. But I extended credit to half the widows in this town after the cave-in, and I'm still waiting on most of it. I can't afford to carry any more accounts." He pushed the coins back toward her with one finger. Come back when you have the full amount. The shame that flooded through Eliza was hot and thick, like molten metal in her veins. She wanted to snatch up the coins, to run from the store and never come back. She wanted to disappear entirely, to cease being a burden, to stop being the object of pity in a town that had no pity left to spare. But hunger was a powerful thing. It made cowards of the proud and beggars of the dignified. Please. The word escaped her lips before she could stop it, barely more than a whisper. I haven't eaten in 2 days. I just need... She'll take the bread, and add a pound of bacon, 2 pounds of beans, some coffee, and whatever vegetables you've got that are still good. The voice came from behind her, deep and quiet, but carrying an authority that made Harrison snap to attention. Eliza spun around to find the rancher standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the shopkeeper rather than on her. He was tall, this stranger, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and hands that looked like they'd known hard work all their life. His face was weathered in that way that spoke of years under the sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested he'd spent more time squinting at horizons than smiling at company. His dark hair was shot through with silver at the temples, and his jaw was covered in a few days' worth of beard growth. He wore simple ranch clothes, canvas pants, a wool shirt, a leather vest, all clean but worn from use. Mr. Reed, that's not necessary, Eliza started, but he raised a hand gently, cutting her off without ever looking at her. Just add it to my order, Harrison, the rancher said, and make it quick. I've got cattle to see to before dark. The shopkeeper hesitated for only a moment before nodding and turning to gather the requested items. The miners had given up all pretense of their own business and were openly watching now, curiosity written plain on their dirt-smudged faces. Eliza felt her cheeks burning. This was worse than being denied credit. This was charity, pure and simple, and it made her want to sink through the floorboards. Sir, I can't accept... You're not accepting anything, Caleb Reed said, his tone matter-of-fact as he stepped past her to the counter. I'm buying supplies for my ranch. What Harrison does with them after they leave this store is his business, not mine. He pulled a leather wallet from his pocket and counted out bills onto the counter. The way I figure it, I've got more food stored up than I need, and it'll just go bad if someone doesn't use it. Waste is a sin, wouldn't you say, Harrison? The shopkeeper had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he was already wrapping up the bacon. Yes, sir, Mr. Reed, terrible waste. Eliza stood frozen, her mind racing. She should refuse. She should gather what was left of her dignity and walk out of this store with her head high, even if it meant going hungry for another few days. But the sight of that bacon, the smell of the coffee Harrison was measuring out, the thought of beans simmering on a stove, it made her knees weak with longing. I'll pay you back, she said, her voice tight with emotion she was fighting to control. Every cent. I promise you, mister. Reed, I'm not a... Didn't ask for payment, Caleb said simply. He was counting out additional bills now, more than seemed necessary for the food he'd ordered. And I'm not looking for promises. A man does what he can when he can. That's all there is to it. Harrison finished packing the goods into 2 separate bundles, one large one for Caleb's order, one smaller one with the bread, bacon, beans, coffee, and a few carrots and potatoes that had seen better days but were still edible. The shopkeeper tied both bundles with twine and pushed them across the counter. Caleb picked up his bundle and tucked it under one arm, then gestured to the smaller package. Mrs. Chen's boarding house, isn't it? Above the seamstress shop? Eliza nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. That's on my way, Caleb said, though they both knew it wasn't. The boarding house was on the opposite end of the town from the direction his wagon was facing. I'll give you a ride. Save you carrying that in the cold. It was phrased as practicality, not charity. Everything about this man seemed designed to preserve her dignity while dismantling her defenses. Eliza didn't know whether to be grateful or resentful. In the end, hunger made the decision for her. She picked up the bundle, feeling its precious weight in her arms, and nodded. Thank you. If Caleb heard the crack in her voice, he had the grace not to acknowledge it. The wagon was old but well-maintained, with a worn bench seat and a flatbed that smelled of hay and leather. Caleb helped her up with a hand that was calloused but gentle, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The 2 draft horses responded to his quiet click of tongue against teeth, and the wagon lurched into motion. They rode in silence through the gray streets of Silveridge. The town had the look of a place slowly giving up, buildings with peeling paint, windows covered with boards instead of glass, sidewalks with missing planks that no one bothered to replace. The silver boom had gone bust 3 years ago, and most of the mines had closed. The ones still operating were running on hope and stubborn pride more than actual profit. Thomas had been one of the stubborn ones. He'd believed the Silver Queen mine still had good veins, had believed the owners when they said the deep tunnels were safe. He'd believed right up until the ceiling came down and turned belief into a tomb. Eliza pushed the memory away. The past was a luxury she couldn't afford any more than she could afford that extra penny. "How long have you been in Silveridge, Mrs. Moore?" Caleb's question was casual, his eyes on the road ahead. It was the first thing he'd said since they left the store, and Eliza was almost grateful for the sound of another human voice, even if it meant answering questions she'd rather avoid. 8 months, she said. "My husband brought me here last spring. He worked in the Silver Queen." Caleb nodded slowly. "The cave-in?" "Yes." Another silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Caleb seemed like a man at ease with quiet, someone who didn't feel the need to fill every moment with words. It was refreshing, in a way. Most people either avoided her entirely or peppered her with invasive questions disguised as concern. "What about you?" Eliza asked, partly out of politeness, partly out of genuine curiosity. "How long have you been ranching here?" "Going on 12 years now," Caleb said. "Bought the land when it was cheap, back before the silver rush brought folks flooding in. Built the ranch up from nothing, just me and my brother at first. Then he got married and moved to California. Been running it myself since then." "That must be hard work," Eliza said, "managing a ranch alone." "It is," Caleb admitted, "but I've got a couple of hands who help during busy seasons, and I'm used to the rhythm of it. Ranch work is honest work. Animals don't care about your past or your prospects. They just need feeding and tending, same as any living thing." There was something almost philosophical in the way he said it, and Eliza found herself studying his profile as he drove. There was a steadiness to him, a kind of quiet strength that had nothing to do with his physical size. He reminded her of the old oak trees that dotted the landscape, weathered by storms but still standing, roots deep enough to withstand whatever came. The boarding house came into view too quickly. Eliza wasn't ready for this strange interlude to end, wasn't ready to face the reality of her small room and her uncertain future. But Caleb was already pulling the horses to a stop, already climbing down from the wagon to help her descend. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway of the seamstress shop, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with the kind of assessment that missed nothing. She was a small woman, barely reaching Eliza's shoulder, but she had a presence that made up for her size. She'd been kind to Eliza after Thomas died, kinder than she had any obligation to be, and Eliza knew she was abusing that kindness by being late on rent. "Mrs. Moore," the older woman said, nodding politely. Then to Caleb, "Mr. Reed." So they knew each other. Of course they did. In a town this size, everyone knew everyone, at least by sight. Caleb tipped his hat. "Mrs. Chen, I was wondering if I might have a word with you about Mrs. Moore here." Eliza's stomach dropped. Was he going to tell Mrs. Chen about the store, about her inability to pay for bread? The humiliation would be complete then, witnessed by the one person in this town who'd shown her any real kindness. But Caleb's next words caught her completely off guard. "I'm looking to hire someone to help out at the ranch," he said, his tone businesslike. "Light work, mending, cleaning, some cooking, maybe help with the chickens and the garden. I've been meaning to find someone for a while now, but good help is hard to come by. Mrs. Moore mentioned she does mending work. I thought she might be interested in the position." Eliza stared at him, her mouth slightly open. She'd mentioned no such thing, or rather she'd mentioned it to Harrison, not to Caleb. But the rancher's expression was perfectly neutral, as if this were a conversation he'd been planning to have all along. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "Fair wages, of course. $1 a day plus meals while she's working. It's not full-time work, maybe 4 or 5 days a week to start, depending on what needs doing. But it's steady and honest." $1 a day. Eliza's mind reeled. That was more than fair wages. It was generous, bordering on excessive for the kind of light work he was describing. A man could hire a ranch hand for not much more than that. I see, Mrs. Chen said slowly. She turned her penetrating gaze on Eliza. What do you think, Mrs. Moore? Does this interest you? Eliza looked between them, trying to process what was happening. This was charity again, disguised as employment. It had to be. Caleb Reed didn't need a maid or a cook or whatever he was claiming. He was a single man on a ranch. He'd obviously been managing fine on his own for years. But even as her pride bristled at the obvious fiction, her practical side was doing rapid calculations. $1 a day, even for just 4 days a week, would be enough to pay her rent with some left over. 5 days a week would let her start saving, maybe even start planning for a future beyond day-to-day survival. And there was something else, something harder to name. When Caleb looked at her, he didn't see a charity case or a burden or a widow to be pitied. He saw a person. Someone capable of work, deserving of wages, entitled to dignity. I'm interested, she heard herself say. If you're truly in need of help, Mr. Reed, I'd be grateful for the work. Caleb nodded once, satisfied. Good. Can you start Monday? I'll pick you up at dawn. We'll work out the details of what needs doing as we go. Monday, Eliza repeated. Yes, I can start Monday. Fine then. He tipped his hat to both women. Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Moore, I'll see you Monday morning. He climbed back onto his wagon, and with another quiet click to his horses, he was gone, the wagon rattling down the dusty street until it disappeared around a corner. Eliza stood holding her bundle of food, watching until the dust settled, trying to understand what had just happened. That's an interesting development, Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying a note of amusement. Caleb Reed has been managing that ranch alone for better than 5 years now, ever since old Jim Hooper retired. Never heard him mention needing help before. Eliza turned to face her landlady, expecting to see judgment or suspicion, but Mrs. Chen's expression was surprisingly warm. He's a good man, the older woman continued. Honest, fair in his dealings. If he says he needs help, then he needs help. And if he says he'll pay fair wages, he'll pay fair wages. She paused, then added quietly, and if he's stretching the truth a bit about needing help, well, sometimes a kind lie is better than a cruel truth. The words hung in the air between them. Eliza felt something hot and uncomfortable press against the back of her eyes, tears she refused to shed in public, not even in front of someone as kind as Mrs. Chen. Come inside, the older woman said gently. Bring your supplies up to your room, and perhaps after you've had something to eat, you can help me with some sewing. I have a dress that needs altering, and my eyes aren't what they used to be. It was another kindness dressed as practicality, and Eliza found herself blinking hard against the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Yes, ma'am, she managed. I'd be happy to help. That night, after a meal of bread and bacon that tasted better than anything she'd eaten in months, Eliza sat in her small room and stared at the coins still clutched in her hand. 24 cents. 2 pennies short of survival, 2 pennies short of dignity. But somehow, a stranger had bridged that gap without making her feel small. He'd given her not just food, but work. Not just charity, but purpose. Not just survival, but hope. She thought about Caleb Reed's weathered face, his quiet voice, the way he'd looked past her worn dress and trembling hands to see something worth hiring. She thought about the way he'd phrased everything as if he were the one in need, as if she were doing him the favor rather than the other way around. Outside her window, Silveridge settled into its nightly silence. Somewhere in the darkness, on a ranch she'd never seen, a man was probably tending his animals, securing his property, preparing for another day of hard work. A man who'd seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up without crushing what remained of her pride. Eliza closed her fingers around the coins and made a silent promise to herself. She would work harder than Caleb Reed had ever imagined. She would prove herself worth every cent of those wages, worth the risk he was taking on her. She would show him that his kindness hadn't been wasted on someone who would take advantage or falter at the first sign of difficulty. She didn't know it yet, but Caleb Reed was making his own promise in the darkness of his ranch house, staring at the empty rooms he'd been living with for so long, he'd almost forgotten what it meant to share space with another person. He told himself he was helping out a widow in need. He told himself it was just Christian charity, the kind of thing any decent person would do. He'd told himself that the ache he'd felt watching her count out those coins had nothing to do with the way the lamplight caught in her hair, or the quiet dignity in her voice when she'd asked for credit, or the strength it must have taken for her to walk into that store knowing she didn't have enough money. He'd told himself a lot of things. But as he banked the fire and headed to bed, Caleb Reed was honest enough with himself to admit that somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place he wasn't quite ready to examine too closely, he'd already started thinking about what it might be like to see Eliza Moore every morning, to hear her voice in rooms that had been silent too long, to have a reason to come in from the fields at midday instead of working straight through until dark. He'd hired her because she needed the work. That was the truth. But the reason he'd noticed her need in the first place, the reason he'd been unable to look away when she'd stood at that counter with her world crumbling around her, that was something else entirely. Monday morning came cold and clear, with a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Eliza was awake before dawn, her meager belongings already packed into the small carpet bag Thomas had given her when they'd married. She'd spent Sunday washing her only other dress and altering it as best she could, trying to make the worn fabric look more presentable. Mrs. Chen had helped, producing a length of ribbon from her supplies and showing Eliza how to trim the collar in a way that made it look intentional rather than desperate. "You look fine," Mrs. Chen had said, standing back to examine her work. "More than fine. Caleb Reed is getting a good worker. Don't let him or anyone convince you otherwise." Now, as Eliza stood in the pre-dawn darkness, she thought about those words. Good worker, not poor widow, not charity case. Worker. The rattle of wagon wheels announced Caleb's arrival precisely at dawn. Eliza had been watching for him, and she stepped outside before he could knock, not wanting to wake the other boarders. Mrs. Chen appeared anyway, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes sharp even at this early hour. "Mr. Reed," she said in greeting. "Mrs. Chen." Caleb removed his hat. "I'll have her back before dark, and I'll pay her wages each week, in advance if she prefers." It was a subtle reassurance, a way of telling Mrs. Chen that Eliza would be able to make her rent, but the older woman just nodded as if this were the most natural arrangement in the world. "See that you do, Mr. Reed, and see that she gets a proper meal at midday. She's too thin by half." Eliza felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, but Caleb just nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am. I'll make sure of it." The ride out to the ranch took nearly an hour, following a rutted road that wound through increasingly sparse landscape. As they left Silveridge behind, the land opened up into rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stand of trees. Caleb kept the horses at a steady pace, neither rushing nor dawdling, and the silence between them felt companionable rather than awkward. As the sun began to crest the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Caleb gestured toward a valley ahead. "There. That's the ranch." Eliza leaned forward, following his gaze. At first, all she could see was more of the same scrubland, but then details began to emerge. A wooden fence line, a barn with a fresh coat of red paint, a house that looked small from this distance but grew larger as they approached. The ranch house was simple but well built, constructed of weathered wood with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting Caleb had banked a fire before leaving to fetch her. Behind the house, she could see the barn, a chicken coop, what looked like a vegetable garden covered with mulch for winter, and beyond it all, pastures where dark shapes that must be cattle grazed in the morning light. "It's beautiful," Eliza said, surprised by how much she meant it. After months in Silveridge's dying streets, the openness of the ranch felt like breathing for the first time in ages. "It's home," Caleb said simply. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and helped her down. "Come on, I'll show you around before we get started." The inside of the house was as neat as a bachelor's quarters could be, which was to say it was clean but sparse. The main room served as kitchen and living area both, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a simple wooden table with 4 chairs near the window. Through an open door, Eliza could see what looked like a bedroom, and there was a ladder leading up to what must be a loft. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Moore," Caleb said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "The place needs a woman's touch. I keep things clean enough, but I'm not much for making things comfortable. I figure you can start wherever you think needs the most work. Eliza turned slowly, taking it all in. The floors were swept but not scrubbed. The windows were clean enough to see through, but could have used a proper washing. The kitchen area had the basics: a cast iron stove, a dry sink, shelves with dishes and supplies, but lacked any of the small comforts that turned a house into a home. "I can work with this," she said. Then, more carefully, "But Mr. Reed, I have to ask, do you truly need help, or are you just being kind?" Caleb met her eyes, and something flickered in his expression. Respect, maybe, for her directness. "Both," he said finally. "I need help because I've been letting things slide for too long, working myself near to exhaustion trying to keep up with everything. And I'm being kind because you need work, and I've got work that needs doing. Don't see why those two things can't exist together." It was the most honest answer she could have hoped for, and Eliza found herself nodding slowly. "Fair enough," she said. "Then where would you like me to start?" The first day set a pattern that would hold through the weeks to come. Caleb showed Eliza where he kept supplies, explained what needed doing with the chickens and the garden, and pointed out places in the house that could use attention. Then he headed out to work with the cattle, leaving her to manage her own time. It was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. Eliza was used to taking orders, used to being told exactly what was needed and when, but Caleb treated her like a partner in the ranch's operation, trusting her judgment about what to prioritize. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing surfaces that had probably never been properly cleaned, organizing supplies in a way that made sense, washing curtains that had gone gray with neglect. The work was physical and demanding, but it felt good to be useful again, to see immediate results from her efforts. Around midday, Caleb came back to the house, stomping his boots clean on the porch before entering. Eliza had soup simmering on the stove, made from the vegetables he'd shown her in the root cellar, with some of the bacon from Saturday, and fresh bread warming from loaves she'd baked that morning, using the sourdough starter she'd found in the pantry. Caleb stopped in the doorway, his nose twitching at the smell. "That smells like heaven," he said simply. "Sit," Eliza instructed, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. "You've been working all morning. You need to eat." He didn't argue, just washed his hands in the basin she'd filled and sat at the table. Eliza served them both, and for a few minutes they ate in silence. She watched him from the corner of her eye, noted the way he closed his eyes briefly at the first spoonful, the way his shoulders relaxed slightly as he ate. "This is good," Caleb said finally. "Better than anything I've made in years." "It's simple food," Eliza replied, but she couldn't quite keep the pleasure from her voice. "Nothing fancy." "Don't need fancy," Caleb said. "Just need it to taste like someone cares." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Eliza looked down at her own bowl, her throat suddenly tight. After the meal, Caleb insisted on clearing the dishes while Eliza went out to check on the chickens. The coop was well built and secure, and the hens clucked contentedly as she scattered feed and collected eggs. There was something deeply satisfying about the simple task, about the warm weight of eggs in her basket, about knowing these small creatures depended on her care. When she returned to the house, Caleb was back outside, working on mending a section of fence. Eliza watched him for a moment from the window, the steady rhythm of his movements, the economical way he used his strength, the concentration on his weathered face. She thought about what Mrs. Chen had said. Caleb Reed was a good man, honest, fair in his dealings. But there was more to it than that, Eliza was beginning to realize. He was also lonely, though he'd probably never admit it. Lonely in the way of men who'd grown used to solitude, who'd stopped expecting companionship and had learned to fill their days with work instead of conversation. She understood that loneliness. She'd been living with it herself since Thomas died, a hollow ache that no amount of activity could quite fill. But here, in this simple house with its clean scrubbed floors and simmering soup, with chickens to tend and work to do, and a man who treated her like she mattered, here, for the first time in 8 months, Eliza felt the edges of that loneliness begin to soften. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, steadily, the ranch began to transform. Eliza attacked neglected corners with determination, turning chaos into order, grime into gleaming surfaces, emptiness into something approaching home. She mended curtains and sewed new ones from fabric Caleb bought in town, She organized the tack room, weeded the garden, repaired tears in his work shirts, and cooked meals that filled the house with warmth and the smell of comfort. But more than the physical transformation, something else was changing too. The silence between them evolved from awkward to comfortable, punctuated by easy conversations over meals, shared observations about the weather or the cattle, or the small dramas of ranch life. Caleb talked about the land with a quiet passion that revealed depths she hadn't expected. He knew the names of every wildflower that bloomed in spring, could read weather patterns in the color of the evening sky, understood the rhythms of the seasons, the way musicians understood music. And Eliza found herself sharing too, small things at first, safe memories of her childhood in Missouri, stories about learning to sew from her mother, careful observations about the world that avoided the painful territory of Thomas's death and the months that had followed. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into her employment, Eliza was in the garden preparing beds for spring planting when Caleb approached, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Moore," he said, "I was wondering if you might consider taking on additional days, full-time if you're willing." Eliza sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "Full-time? Mr. Reed, I'm already here 5 days a week. I'm not sure what more—" "7 days," Caleb interrupted gently, "with room and board here at the ranch, if that's acceptable. There's a bedroom in the back that's sitting empty. It's small, but it's yours if you want it. You could still visit Mrs. Chen whenever you like, of course. I'd pay you extra for the room and board, another 50 cents a day to cover your expenses in town." Eliza stared at him, her mind spinning. "Live here? At the ranch? Full-time?" "I don't understand," she said slowly. "What would I do with 7 days that I'm not already doing with 5? Caleb shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable in a way she'd never seen before. "Truth is, it's getting harder to let you leave at the end of each day. Not because of the work," he added quickly, seeing her expression change. Because this place is better with you in it. Because meals taste better when they're shared. Because the house feels like a home instead of just a place to sleep." He paused, then continued more quietly. "And because I think you're safer here than in town. Silveridge is dying, Mrs. Moore. More families leave every week. It's not going to be long before there's nothing left but empty buildings and bad memories. I'd rest easier knowing you were somewhere stable." Eliza's heart was beating too fast. This was a threshold, she realized, a decision that would change everything. Living here, sharing meals every day, becoming part of the fabric of Caleb's life rather than just someone who came and went. It would mean something. It would look like something to anyone who knew about it. "What would people say?" she asked quietly. "Mrs. Chen would be your chaperone in reference," Caleb said immediately. "And I'd make it clear to anyone who asked that you're my employee, nothing more. Your reputation would be protected." "Your reputation," Eliza noticed. "Not our reputations." Caleb was willing to bear the brunt of any gossip or speculation, willing to shield her from the kind of talk that could ruin a woman in a place like this. "I need to think about it," Eliza said. "Of course," Caleb agreed. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands whenever you're ready." But they both knew she'd already made her decision. The only question was whether she had the courage to accept it. That night, lying in her narrow bed at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, Eliza thought about the ranch, about the wide sky and the clean air, about chickens clucking in their coop and cattle lowing in the distance, about a house that was becoming a home, and a man who'd given her back her dignity when the world had tried to take it away. She thought about Thomas, about the love they'd shared and the life they'd planned. She thought about the fact that he was gone and she was still here, still alive, still needing to find a way forward, even when the path ahead was uncertain. And she thought about Caleb Reed, who'd paid for a loaf of bread and somehow changed the entire trajectory of her life. The next morning, when Caleb arrived to pick her up, Eliza had her carpet bag packed with all her worldly possessions. "I'll take the job," she said simply. "Full-time, room and board." Caleb's face remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, relief perhaps, or gladness, or something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. "Good," he said. "That's good." He helped her into the wagon, and they rode toward the ranch in silence. But it was a different silence than before, fuller somehow, weighted with possibility and the first fragile threads of something that might, given time and care, grow into something neither of them had dared to hope for. Eliza watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, watched the land open up before them, and felt something shift in her chest. For the first time since Thomas died, the future didn't look like just more of the same gray struggle for survival. It looked like morning. It looked like hope. It looked like home. The small bedroom at the back of Caleb's ranch house had a window that faced east, and on Eliza's first morning waking up there, the sunrise came through the glass like liquid gold, spilling across the plain wooden floor and the simple quilt Mrs. Chen had insisted she take. For a moment, suspended between sleep and waking, Eliza forgot where she was. Then memory returned, not with the sharp pain of loss she'd grown accustomed to, but with something quieter, something that felt almost like peace. She dressed quickly in the cold morning air, her breath visible in small clouds. The house was silent, but when she emerged from her room, she found the kitchen stove already radiating warmth and a pot of coffee sitting on the back burner, still hot. Through the window, she could see Caleb in the barn, a lantern casting long shadows as he moved between the stalls. Eliza poured herself a cup of coffee and stood at the window watching him work. There was something meditative about his movements, a kind of quiet competence that spoke of years of practice. He moved the way water moved, finding the path of least resistance, accomplishing what needed doing without wasted effort or unnecessary flourish. She was still standing there when he emerged from the barn, and their eyes met across the distance. He raised one hand in greeting, and she lifted her coffee cup in response. Such a small moment, such an ordinary exchange, but it filled something in Eliza's chest that had been empty for too long. By the time Caleb came inside, stamping snow from his boots, Eliza had breakfast underway. Eggs from the hen house, bacon sizzling in the cast iron skillet, biscuits rising in the oven. The kitchen smelled like salt and butter and comfort. "You didn't have to do all this," Caleb said, hanging his coat on the peg. "I usually just make do with coffee and whatever's left from the night before." "And that's exactly why you needed to hire someone," Eliza replied, not looking up from the stove. "A man can't work a full day on nothing but coffee and cold beans." She heard the smile in his voice even before she glanced over her shoulder to see it. "Yes, ma'am." They ate together at the table, the morning light growing stronger through the window, and Eliza found herself studying the way Caleb's hands looked wrapped around his coffee cup, large and scarred from work, but careful in their movements, never rough or careless. "I thought I'd ride out to the north pasture today," Caleb said, breaking into her thoughts. "Check on the cattle up there. Make sure the water sources haven't frozen over. Should be back by early afternoon." "I'll have dinner ready," Eliza said, "and I was thinking I might tackle that spare room upstairs, the one you've been using for storage." Caleb's eyebrows rose. "That's a mess up there. Old furniture, boxes of things I haven't looked at in years. You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," Eliza interrupted gently. "But if I'm going to live here, I'd like to earn my keep. Besides, it bothers me knowing there's disorder in the house." "Can't argue with that," Caleb said, standing to clear his plate. "Just be careful. Some of those boxes are heavier than they look." After he left, Eliza spent an hour on the morning chores, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, tidying the kitchen, starting a pot of stew for dinner that would simmer all day. Then she climbed the ladder to the loft. Caleb had understated the situation. The loft was packed with accumulated belongings, old furniture draped with dusty sheets, crates filled with books and papers, trunks that looked like they hadn't been opened in a decade. But Eliza had grown up in a household where waste was a sin and organization was next to godliness. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She started by pulling everything into the center of the space, creating pathways around the edges. Then she began sorting, things to keep, things to clean and repair, things that could be donated or sold. She found a rocking chair with a broken runner that just needed a nail and some glue. She found a set of china dishes wrapped in old newspaper, beautiful pieces that deserved to be used instead of buried in the dark. And then, in a trunk shoved into the far corner, she found the photographs. They were in a wooden box, carefully wrapped in cloth. Eliza hesitated before opening it, knowing she was crossing some invisible line, intruding on privacy that Caleb might not want disturbed. But curiosity won out, and she carefully unwrapped the first photograph. A young woman looked back at her from the faded image. She was beautiful in a delicate way, with fair hair and light eyes and a smile that seemed almost shy. She wore a wedding dress, and standing beside her, looking younger but unmistakably himself, was Caleb Reed. Eliza's breath caught. She'd known, of course, that Caleb must have a history. Men didn't reach their late 30s without accumulating past lives, past loves. But seeing the evidence was different from knowing it existed. She studied the photograph, trying to read the story it told. The woman's hand rested on Caleb's arm with obvious affection. His expression was more open than Eliza had ever seen it, younger and less weathered by life. They looked happy. They looked like people who expected their happiness to last forever. There were other photographs in the box. The same woman on the porch of this very house, the woman holding a basket of vegetables from the garden, the woman and Caleb standing with another couple who must have been his brother and sister-in-law. Each image was a window into a life that had existed before Eliza ever came to Silveridge, before the cave-in, before the penny at the counter. That was Margaret. Eliza spun around so fast she nearly dropped the photograph. Caleb stood at the top of the ladder, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the loft. "I'm sorry," Eliza said quickly, carefully placing the photograph back in the box. "I shouldn't have. I was just sorting things, and I found the trunk, and I didn't mean to pry into your private—" "It's all right," Caleb said, crossing to where she stood. He picked up the wedding photograph, his thumb brushing across the image. "You're bound to find things living here. No sense pretending they don't exist." Eliza waited, giving him space to continue or to close the subject as he chose. "We were married for 3 years," Caleb said quietly. "She died of pneumonia the winter after this photograph was taken. We'd been planning to start a family that spring." He set the photograph down gently. "She was a good woman, kind, patient with me when I didn't deserve patience." "I'm sorry for your loss," Eliza said, and meant it with her whole heart. Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared grief, shared survival, shared understanding of what it meant to lose someone you'd planned to spend your life with. "How long were you married?" he asked. "You and your husband?" 2 years, Eliza said. "We met in Missouri. Thomas was working on the railroad then, saving money. He had dreams of making something of himself, of finding opportunity out west." She smiled sadly. He found Silveridge instead. "You loved him." It wasn't a question, but Eliza answered anyway. "I did. Not in the way stories talk about, not with passion that burns everything else away, but steady, comfortable. He was a good man who tried hard and wanted to do right by me." "That's worth something," Caleb said. "Yes," Eliza agreed. "It is." They stood in the dusty loft, surrounded by the remnants of past lives, and the silence between them was full of the things neither could quite say. That grief never fully left, it just made room for other things. That the past deserved honor but didn't have to dictate the future. That two people who'd both known loss might understand each other in ways that made the loneliness easier to bear. "I came back because I saw your smoke," Caleb said finally, "from the chimney. I was worried something might be wrong." "Nothing's wrong," Eliza assured him. "I just got carried away with the sorting. I'll have dinner ready within the hour." Caleb nodded, but he didn't move toward the ladder. Instead, he reached past her and picked up one of the other photographs, the one of Margaret in the garden. "She would have liked you," he said. Margaret. She always said this house was too quiet, that it needed the sound of living in it. Children's laughter, women's voices, the kind of noise that comes from a full life instead of an empty one. He set the photograph down carefully. "I think she'd be glad someone's here, making it feel like a home again." The words settled over Eliza like a benediction, like permission she hadn't known she needed. To be here, to make changes, to let her presence shape the space instead of trying to remain invisible within it. "Thank you," she said softly. Caleb met her eyes, and for just a moment, something flickered in his expression. Something warm and unguarded that made Eliza's heart skip in a way she absolutely was not ready to examine. "I'll let you get back to work," he said, and disappeared down the ladder before she could respond. Eliza stood alone in the loft, her hand pressed against her chest where her heart was beating too fast, and tried to convince herself that what she'd just felt was nothing more than gratitude, nothing more than the natural warmth that came from kindness and understanding. She was not, she told herself firmly, developing feelings for Caleb Reed, but the flutter in her chest suggested otherwise, and the way her eyes kept drifting to the ladder he'd descended suggested that her heart was already several steps ahead of what her mind was willing to acknowledge. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient, as if Eliza and Caleb were discovering a pattern that had always existed, waiting for them to step into it. The work of the ranch continued with the changing season, ice breaking up in the streams, the first brave shoots of green pushing through thawing ground, calves being born in the barn with Eliza standing watch alongside Caleb through long, cold nights. She learned the language of the ranch, the small signs that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read them, the way the cattle grouped together when a storm was coming, the particular cluck a hen made when she was ready to set, the shift in wind that meant the weather would turn within hours. And Caleb, in turn, seemed to be learning her. He anticipated when she'd need help lifting something heavy, appeared with firewood before she had to ask, remembered without prompting that she preferred her coffee with just a touch of sugar. Small attentions that added up to something larger, something that made Eliza's carefully constructed walls begin to feel less like protection and more like barriers keeping something good at bay. One evening in late March, they were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set in spectacular shades of orange and purple. Eliza had brought her mending basket outside, and her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of repairing a tear in one of Caleb's work shirts. "You're too good at that," Caleb observed, watching her needle fly through the fabric. "My mother taught me," Eliza said. "She used to say that a woman who could sew could always find a way to survive, no matter what life threw at her." "She was right," Caleb said, "though I imagine she hoped you'd use the skill for more than just survival." Eliza paused in her stitching, considering. "She hoped I'd have a home and a family and a husband who could provide well enough that sewing was a pleasure instead of a necessity." She smiled ruefully. "Life doesn't always give us what our mothers hoped for us." "No," Caleb agreed quietly. "It doesn't." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the porch boards and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Then Caleb spoke again, his voice careful. "I've been thinking about expanding the herd, maybe adding some sheep as well, diversifying income. But it would mean more work, more hands needed during busy seasons." "That sounds like a good plan," Eliza said, still focused on her mending. "Sheep would do well on this land." "I'd need to hire help," Caleb continued. "At least one steady hand, maybe two during calving and shearing seasons, which means building another cabin, probably, or adding onto the barn to create proper quarters." "You've clearly thought this through," Eliza observed. "I have." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then added, "I wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable with other people around. I know you've gotten used to it being just us here." Eliza's hand stilled on the fabric. The question beneath his words was clear enough. Was she happy with how things were? Did she want things to change? "Caleb," she said slowly, setting down her mending, "this is your ranch. You should make whatever decisions are best for it. You don't need my permission to hire hands or expand your operation." "That's not what I'm asking," Caleb said. He turned to look at her directly, his expression serious. "I'm asking if you're content here. If this arrangement is working for you the way I hope it's working for me. The way I hope it's working for me." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that neither had quite voiced before. "I'm content," Eliza said, and was surprised by how much truth the simple words carried. "More than content. For the first time since Thomas died, I feel like I'm living instead of just surviving." Something in Caleb's expression softened. "Good. That's good." He stood then, stretching muscles tired from a long day's work. "I should check on that new calf one more time before bed. Want to come?" It was an invitation he'd extended dozens of times before, but tonight it felt different somehow. Tonight, walking to the barn beside him felt less like employer and employee and more like something else entirely, something Eliza wasn't quite ready to name but couldn't quite deny either. The calf in question was 3 days old, all spindly legs and curious eyes, nursing from its mother in the warm shelter of the barn. Caleb leaned against the stall door, watching with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd helped bring new life into the world. "Never gets old," he murmured, watching them figure out how to stand, how to walk, how to be alive. "It's a miracle," Eliza agreed, standing beside him. every time. Caleb looked at her then, and in the golden lamplight of the barn, his eyes held something that made Eliza's breath catch. Not desire exactly, though there was warmth there, more like recognition. Like he was seeing her clearly for the first time, or maybe seeing something he'd been trying not to see for weeks. "Eliza's," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name instead of the formal Mrs. Moore. "I need to tell you something." Her heart began to beat faster. "All right." But whatever Caleb had been about to say was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. They both turned toward the barn door, and a moment later, a rider appeared, young Billy Thompson from the neighboring ranch, his face flushed with exertion. "Mr. Reed," Billy called, sliding off his horse in a hurry. "My pa sent me to fetch you. We've got trouble. Rustlers hit our north pasture last night. Took maybe 20 head of cattle. Pa's gathering men to track them, and he's hoping you'll join." Caleb's expression shifted immediately, going hard and focused. "How long ago did they leave sign?" "Maybe 6 hours, Pa figures. Trail's still fresh enough to follow if we move fast." "Give me 10 minutes to saddle up and grab supplies," Caleb said. He turned to Eliza. "I don't know how long I'll be gone. Could be a day, could be 3 or 4 if the trail leads far. Will you be all right here alone?" "I'll be fine," Eliza assured him, though her stomach had dropped at the mention of rustlers. Cattle theft was serious business on the frontier, and men who stole livestock didn't hesitate to shoot anyone who got in their way. "Just be careful." "Always am," Caleb said, but his expression was grim as he headed to the tack room. Eliza helped him prepare, moving with efficient speed to pack food and water for the trail, checking his rifle to make sure it was loaded and in good working order. Within 15 minutes, Caleb was mounted and ready to ride. "Keep the doors locked," he instructed. "And if anyone comes around you don't know, don't answer. The rifle's loaded and hanging over the door. You remember how to use it?" "I remember," Eliza said. Thomas had taught her to shoot back when they'd first come west. She wasn't an expert, but she could hit what she aimed at if necessary. "Good." Caleb hesitated, then reached down from his saddle and briefly touched her shoulder. "I'll be back as soon as I can." And then he was gone, riding into the gathering darkness with young Billy Thompson, leaving Eliza standing alone in the ranch yard with only the stars and the distant cattle for company. The house felt enormous that night, full of empty spaces and creaking boards that Eliza had never noticed before. She locked the doors as Caleb had instructed, checked the windows, made sure the rifle was where she could reach it quickly. Then she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she didn't really want and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong when men went hunting rustlers. She tried not to think about the fact that Caleb had been about to tell her something important before Billy arrived. She tried not to wonder what he would have said if they hadn't been interrupted. She tried not to acknowledge how much it mattered to her that he come back safe. But sitting alone in the dark house, listening to the wind outside and the settling of timbers, Eliza could no longer deny what had been growing between them for weeks. This wasn't just gratitude for employment. This wasn't just the comfort of companionship or the convenience of shared space. Somewhere between the penny at the counter and the photographs in the loft, between early morning coffee and evening conversations on the porch, Eliza had fallen in love with Caleb Reed. The realization should have terrified her. She'd known him for barely 2 months. She was living in his house as his employee. The whole situation was improper by any conventional standard, and if anyone in Silveridge knew the truth of how much time they spent alone together, her reputation would be in shreds. But sitting in his kitchen, surrounded by the life they'd been building together, Eliza found she didn't care about convention or propriety or what anyone else might think. She cared about a man who'd seen her at her lowest and helped without humiliating her. She cared about quiet strength and unexpected kindness and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She cared about someone who talked to her like an equal, who trusted her judgment, who'd given her back not just employment, but dignity and purpose. She cared, and that caring had grown into something deeper without her permission or her planning. The question was what to do about it. Eliza was still pondering that question 3 days later when Caleb finally returned. She was in the chicken coop collecting the afternoon eggs when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her heart leaped, and she had to force herself to walk calmly out of the coop instead of running to meet him. Caleb looked exhausted as he dismounted. His face was covered in trail dust, his clothes were dirty, and there was a bandage wrapped around his left forearm that hadn't been there when he left. "You're hurt," Eliza said, crossing to him immediately. "It's nothing," Caleb said, but he swayed slightly as his feet hit the ground, and Eliza caught his arm to steady him. "When's the last time you ate a proper meal?" she demanded. "Day before yesterday, I think. Maybe longer." Caleb managed a tired smile. "We caught them, though. Got all the Thompson cattle back and turned the rustlers over to the law in Silver Fork." "Good," Eliza said firmly. "Now get inside and sit down before you fall down. I'm going to feed you and then look at that arm." For once, Caleb didn't argue. He let Eliza lead him into the house, let her settle him at the table, let her take charge in a way that felt natural and right. She heated up the stew she'd kept simmering in case he returned, cut thick slices of fresh bread, poured strong coffee. While he ate, she heated water and gathered clean bandages. "Tell me what happened," she said, as she carefully unwrapped the dirty bandage from his arm. "One of the rustlers didn't want to come quietly," Caleb said, wincing as she exposed the wound, a long gash that had been stitched but was red and inflamed around the edges. "Had a knife. I've had worse." "That doesn't make it better," Eliza said, examining the stitches with a critical eye. "These are infected. Who did this stitching?" "Doc Patterson, over in Silver Fork. He said to keep it clean and dry." "Well, you haven't been doing that," Eliza said, but her tone was gentle as she cleaned the wound with warm water and soap, being as careful as she could even when Caleb hissed with pain. "I'm going to make a poultice, my mother's recipe, honey and herbs. It'll help with the infection." While she worked, Caleb watched her face with an intensity that made her hands want to shake. But Eliza kept her movements steady, kept her attention on the task at hand, and tried not to think about how close they were sitting, how intimate it felt to tend his wounds, how right it seemed to be taking care of him this way. "I missed this," Caleb said quietly. Eliza's hands paused. "Missed what?" "This. Home. Someone waiting." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Someone worrying about whether I'd come back." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow, sweet and sharp at the same time. She finished applying the poultice and wrapped his arm with clean bandages before she trusted herself to respond. "I did worry," she admitted, not looking at him. "Every night you were gone. I worried." "Eliza," Caleb said. And there it was again, her name in his voice, warm and rough and full of things unsaid. She made herself meet his eyes. "Yes?" "What I was going to say. Before Billy came. I need to finish saying it." Eliza's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "All right." Caleb reached out with his good hand and gently took hers, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. "I know this started as employment. I know that's what it's supposed to be. You're my housekeeper. I'm your employer, and there's a proper line that shouldn't be crossed." "Yes," Eliza said, though the word came out barely above a whisper. "But somewhere along the way," Caleb continued, his thumb brushing across her knuckles, "it became more than that for me. And I need to know if it became more for you too, or if I'm about to make a fool of myself." Eliza looked at their joined hands, at the contrast between his sun-darkened skin and her paler fingers, at the rightness of how they fit together. She thought about the past 2 months, about transformation and trust, about learning to laugh again, and discovering that hope could grow in the most unlikely soil. "You're not making a fool of yourself," she said finally, meeting his eyes. "It became more for me, too." The relief that washed over Caleb's face was almost painful to witness. "Thank God," he breathed. "Because, Eliza, I have been half out of my mind these past weeks, trying to figure out how to tell you that somewhere between hiring you and now, I've fallen in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, brave and vulnerable and absolutely terrifying. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of hearing spoken what she'd been afraid to even think. "I love you too," she said, and watched joy transform his tired, wounded features. "I think I started falling that day in the store when you helped me without making me feel small, and I've been falling every day since." Caleb lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I need you to understand something. Your job here is not dependent on your feelings for me. If you want to stay as just my housekeeper with nothing more between us than friendship and work, you can. I won't press you. I won't make things uncomfortable. Your position here is secure regardless." It was exactly what Eliza needed to hear, the assurance that her livelihood didn't depend on returning his affection, that he'd given her an honest choice rather than a coerced decision. "I know," she said softly, "and I choose this. I choose you." Caleb leaned forward then, slowly enough that Eliza could have pulled away if she wanted to, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle and careful and full of restrained longing. It was nothing like the passionate embraces she'd read about in stories. It was better because it was real, because it was them, because it came from months of growing trust and understanding rather than sudden infatuation. When they finally drew apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his good hand still cradling her face. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Only weeks?" Eliza asked, surprised by her own boldness. "I've been thinking about it since the day you carried firewood up to the loft, and I saw you lift those heavy beams like they weighed nothing." Caleb laughed, a sound of pure joy that Eliza had never heard from him before. "So you're telling me I should have been showing off my strength more often?" "I'm telling you that you don't need to show off anything," Eliza said, touching his face gently, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "You're enough exactly as you are." They sat together in the kitchen as the afternoon light faded to evening, talking in a way they'd never quite allowed themselves before. Caleb told her about the loneliness of the years after Margaret died, about throwing himself into ranch work because it was easier than facing an empty house, about the day he saw Eliza at that counter and felt something shift in his chest, something that told him his long winter might finally be ending. Eliza told him about the terror of those first months after Thomas's death, about the slow erosion of hope as her money dwindled and opportunities disappeared, about standing in Harrison's store and feeling like she'd reached the absolute end of everything, and then about the miracle of his intervention, about learning to trust again, about discovering that loss didn't have to be the end of her story. "I felt guilty at first," Eliza admitted. "Loving you felt like a betrayal of Thomas, like I was dishonoring his memory by moving on so quickly." 2 months isn't quick," Caleb said gently. "And even if it were, you're alive, Eliza. You're allowed to keep living. I think your husband would want that for you." "Would Margaret want it for you?" Eliza asked. Caleb considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said finally. "She hated the idea of me being alone. Before she died, she made me promise I wouldn't shut myself away from the world. Took me a long time to understand what she meant, but I think I do now. She meant that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, that finding happiness again isn't an insult to what came before." The wisdom in his words settled over Eliza like a benediction. She thought about Thomas, about the good man he'd been, about how he'd always wanted the best for her. And she knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that he wouldn't want her to spend the rest of her life in mourning. He'd want her to find joy again, to build a new life, to let herself love and be loved. "So where do we go from here?" Eliza asked. "We can't just continue as we have been. People will talk. Mrs. Chen has been wonderfully discreet, but even she can't shield us from gossip forever." "I know," Caleb said, "which is why I'm asking you to marry me." Eliza's breath caught. She'd expected, hoped maybe, that their relationship might progress toward marriage eventually, but she hadn't expected him to propose so quickly, so directly, sitting in his kitchen with bandages on his arm and trail dust still in his hair. "You don't have to answer right away," Caleb added quickly, seeing her expression. "I know it's sudden. I know we've only been honest about our feelings for about an hour. But Eliza, I'm 38 years old. I've been married before. I know what I want, and I want you. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up every morning and know you're here because you chose to be, not because I'm paying you wages." "What about propriety?" Eliza asked, though her heart was already singing yes, yes, yes. "What about a proper courtship? What will people say if we marry after only knowing each other for 2 months?" "Let them talk," Caleb said firmly. "We're both widowed. We're both old enough to make our own decisions, and anyone who knows us will see that this is real, not some hasty mistake." Eliza thought about Mrs. Chen, who'd watched their developing relationship with knowing eyes, and never once suggested impropriety. She thought about the Thompson family, who'd welcomed her warmly the few times she'd accompanied Caleb to their ranch. She thought about the wider community of Silveridge, dying though it was, and realized she didn't particularly care what most of them thought. "Yes," she said, the word coming out strong and clear. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across Caleb's face was like sunrise after a long night. He pulled her close, ignoring the twinge of pain from his injured arm, and kissed her again with more confidence this time, more certainty. This was a kiss that spoke of futures and promises, of partnership and permanence. "How soon?" Eliza asked when they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless. "As soon as we can arrange it," Caleb said. "I don't want to wait, Eliza. I've waited long enough already." They decided on 2 weeks. Enough time to make arrangements, but not so long that doubt or worry could creep in. Caleb rode into Silveridge the next day to speak with Reverend Morrison, while Eliza stayed at the ranch and tried to comprehend how completely her life had transformed in such a short time. Mrs. Chen arrived 3 days before the wedding, arriving unannounced in a wagon loaded with fabric and supplies. She swept into the ranch house like a small, efficient storm, immediately taking stock of everything that needed doing. "A wedding dress," she announced, pulling bolts of cloth from her wagon. "You cannot be married in that worn brown thing you've been living in. I brought silk, cotton, lace. We'll make something suitable." "Mrs. Chen, I can't afford," Eliza began, but the older woman cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Did I ask for payment? This is my wedding gift. Now stop arguing and let me measure you." Over the next 3 days, Mrs. Chen worked magic with needle and thread, creating a dress that was simple but elegant. Cream-colored silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, fitted at the waist and falling in soft folds to the floor. It wasn't the elaborate gown Eliza had worn when she married Thomas, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and when she tried it on for the final fitting, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. "You look happy," Mrs. Chen observed, pinning the hem. "That's better than any expensive dress could make you look." "I am happy," Eliza said, surprised by how much she meant it. "Terrified, but happy." "Good," Mrs. Chen said briskly. "Fear means you understand what you're choosing. Only fools walk into marriage without some fear." She sat back on her heels, examining her work. "But Caleb Reed is a good man. He'll be a good husband, and you'll be good for him. You already have been. I've known him for 12 years, and I've never seen him look the way he looks at you." "How does he look at me?" Eliza asked, curious. "Like your water, and he's been dying of thirst," Mrs. Chen said simply. "Like you're the answer to questions he didn't know how to ask." The words stayed with Eliza through the remaining days of preparation. The ranch became a hive of quiet activity. Caleb cleaned and repaired every inch of the property. Eliza prepared food for the small gathering they'd planned. Mrs. Chen made final adjustments to the dress and helped arrange the simple decorations they'd have in the parlor for the ceremony. The Thompson family would attend, along with Mrs. Chen and a handful of other neighbors who'd become friends over the years. It wouldn't be a large wedding, but it would be theirs, and that was all that mattered. The night before the ceremony, Caleb respected tradition and stayed at the Thompson ranch, leaving Eliza and Mrs. Chen alone at the house. They sat together on the porch in the spring darkness, listening to the cattle and watching stars emerge across the vast sky. "Are you certain about this?" Mrs. Chen asked quietly. "It's not too late to change your mind." "I'm certain," Eliza said without hesitation. "More certain than I've been about anything in a long time." "Good." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment, then added, "You know, when you first came to my boarding house after your husband died, I thought you wouldn't last a month. You had that look, like you were just waiting for permission to give up." "I was," Eliza admitted. "Some days, giving up seemed easier than keeping on." "But you didn't give up," Mrs. Chen said. "You kept going, even when it was hard, even when you had nothing but pride to sustain you. And look where that strength brought you, to a good man, a good home, a new beginning." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For taking me in when you didn't have to. For being kind when kindness was in short supply. For bringing me that fabric and making this dress, and being here now." "You don't need to thank me for decency," Mrs. Chen said, but her voice was soft. "We all need help sometimes. The trick is knowing when to accept it and when to stand on your own. You've learned that balance. That's why you'll make a good wife for Caleb Reed. They sat together in comfortable silence, two women who'd become friends across the divide of culture and language and circumstance, united by the simple understanding that survival required both strength and the wisdom to accept support when it was offered. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed designed for new beginnings. Eliza woke early in her small bedroom, and for a moment she lay still, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch. Chickens greeting the morning, cattle lowing in distant pastures, the wind moving through the new leaves on the cottonwood trees. This was the last morning she'd wake as Eliza Moore. By sunset, she'd be Eliza Reed, wife to a rancher, partner in building a life from the hard soil of the frontier. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a quiet joy that felt solid and real, nothing like the nervous excitement she'd felt before marrying Thomas. That had been the giddy anticipation of a young woman stepping into the unknown. This was the calm certainty of a woman who'd survived loss and loneliness and learned what truly mattered. Mrs. Chen helped her dress, fastening the tiny buttons that ran down the back of the gown, arranging her hair in a simple style that framed her face. When Eliza finally looked in the mirror, she saw someone she barely recognized, not because of the dress or the careful styling, but because of the light in her own eyes, the straightness of her spine, the absence of the desperate hunger that had marked her features for so long. "You're beautiful," Mrs. Chen said simply. "Now come. It's time." The ceremony was held in the parlor of the ranch house, with spring flowers from the garden arranged on every surface, and afternoon light streaming through the newly cleaned windows. Reverend Morrison stood before the fireplace, his worn Bible in hand, while the small gathering of guests filled the available chairs and stood along the walls. And there was Caleb, dressed in a new suit that he wore with obvious discomfort but undeniable dignity, his dark hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, his eyes fixed on the doorway where Eliza would appear. When she stepped into the room on Mrs. Chen's arm, the older woman serving as her attendant in the absence of family, Caleb's expression transformed into something that made Eliza's breath catch. He looked at her like she was a miracle, like she was everything he'd hoped for and more than he'd dared to dream, like she was coming home. The ceremony itself was simple and brief. Reverend Morrison spoke about partnership and commitment, about the sanctity of marriage and the blessing of finding love in unexpected places. He talked about the frontier's harsh demands requiring strong bonds between husband and wife, about facing whatever came together rather than alone. When it came time for the vows, Caleb's voice was steady as he promised to love and cherish Eliza, to provide for and protect her, to honor her as his partner and equal in all things. His hands were warm and sure as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Margaret's ring, offered with the blessing of memory and the promise of new love. Eliza's own voice shook slightly as she made her promises, but the words came from her heart. She vowed to stand beside Caleb through whatever came, to build a home and a life worthy of the foundation they'd already laid, to love him not just in the easy times, but through the hard seasons that would inevitably come. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Morrison said, his weathered face creasing in a genuine smile. "Caleb, you may kiss your bride." And he did, there in front of witnesses and community, claiming her as his with a kiss that was both chaste and full of promise. When they turned to face their guests, Eliza caught Mrs. Chen wiping tears from her eyes, and even the gruff Mr. Thompson looked suspiciously emotional. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful. Mrs. Thompson had brought a cake she'd baked, and there was music from young Billy Thompson's fiddle. And for a few hours the ranch house was full of laughter and conversation and the warmth of human connection. But eventually the guests departed, heading back to their own homes before dark, and Eliza found herself alone with Caleb in the house that was now truly theirs together. Mrs. Chen was the last to leave, pulling Eliza aside for a final embrace. "Be happy," the older woman whispered. "You've earned it." "I will," Eliza promised. "And thank you for everything." Then Mrs. Chen was gone, and it was just the two of them in the settling twilight, husband and wife, standing in the parlor surrounded by the remnants of their wedding celebration. "Well, Mrs. Reed," Caleb said, offering her his arm with a formality that made her smile. Shall we take a walk? I think I'm too keyed up to sleep just yet. They walked out into the spring evening, across the ranch yard and up the gentle slope behind the house to a spot where they could see the whole valley spread out before them. The sun was setting in spectacular fashion, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold and purple, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang its lonely song. I used to come up here after Margaret died, Caleb said quietly, his arm around Eliza's waist. I'd sit and watch the sunset and try to figure out how to keep going when everything hurt. Some nights I wasn't sure I could. What changed? Eliza asked. Time, mostly. Work. The slow understanding that grief doesn't kill you even when you wish it would. He paused, then added, and eventually, the hope that maybe someday I'd find someone to share the sunsets with again. Eliza leaned into his warmth, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. I'm glad you didn't give up, she said. I'm glad you kept going, even when it hurt, because if you hadn't, you wouldn't have been in that store the day I needed help. You wouldn't have seen me. You wouldn't have cared. Oh, I would have cared, Caleb said. That's who I am, Eliza. I see people who need help and I can't just walk away. It's a compulsion almost. But it was different with me, Eliza insisted. Wasn't it? You didn't just help me. You brought me here. You created a place for me in your life. That's more than simple charity. Caleb turned to face her fully, his hands gentle on her shoulders. You're right, he admitted. It was different with you. From that first moment, seeing you stand there with such dignity while your world crumbled, something in me recognized something in you, like calling to like, survivor to survivor. And I knew, even then, that if I let you walk away, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. So you invented a job you didn't really need, Eliza said, but there was no accusation in it, only affection. I invented a job I desperately needed, Caleb corrected, just not for the reasons I claimed. I needed someone to make this place feel like a home again. I needed a reason to come in from the fields at midday instead of working myself to exhaustion. I needed someone to remind me what it felt like to hope for something beyond just surviving another season. And did you get what you needed? Eliza asked. More than I needed, Caleb said. I got everything I didn't dare ask for. They stood together on the hillside as full darkness fell, watching stars emerge across the vast sky. Eliza thought about the journey that had brought her here, from that terrifying moment at the counter to this perfect evening as a new bride. She thought about how close she'd come to giving up, to letting hunger and despair win, to never knowing what joy might wait on the other side of her darkest moment. I love you, she said, the words still feeling new and precious on her tongue. I don't think I've said it enough today, but I do. I love you, Caleb Reed, and I'm grateful every day that you saw me when I felt invisible. I love you too, Caleb said, pulling her close. And you were never invisible, Eliza. You were just waiting to be seen by someone who knew how to look. Later, much later, they lay together in the darkness of the bedroom that was now theirs to share. Caleb's arms around her, Eliza felt something settle deep in her chest, a sense of rightness, of belonging, of having found her place in a world that had seemed determined to cast her adrift. Are you happy? Caleb murmured against her hair. Yes, Eliza said without hesitation. Are you? Happier than I've been in 5 years, Caleb admitted. Happier than I thought I'd ever be again. They drifted towards sleep, wrapped in each other's warmth. Two people who'd found each other in the ruins of their old lives and built something new from the scattered pieces. Two people who understood that love didn't always arrive with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it came quietly, disguised as necessity, growing slowly from kindness into something unshakable. The next morning, Eliza woke to find Caleb already gone from the bed, but when she emerged from the bedroom, she found him in the kitchen making coffee with the careful concentration of a man still learning the domestic arts. I thought I'd let you sleep in, he said, looking pleased with himself. It's not every day a man gets married, after all. Every day? Eliza teased, crossing to kiss him good morning. How many times are you planning to marry me? Just the once is enough, Caleb said, wrapping his arms around her. But I figured as your husband, I should probably learn to make a decent cup of coffee. Can't have you doing all the work around here. I appreciate the thought, Eliza said, sampling the coffee he'd made. It was terrible, weak and somehow bitter at the same time, but she drank it anyway, touched by his effort. Though perhaps we should stick to our established division of labor. That bad, huh? Caleb asked, grinning. Truly awful, Eliza confirmed, but I love you anyway. They spent the morning working together, falling back into the rhythms they'd established over the past months, but with a new ease born of acknowledged love and legal partnership. Eliza tended the chickens in the garden while Caleb worked with the cattle, and at midday they met back at the house for the meal Eliza had prepared. It was during this meal, sitting at the table with spring sunshine streaming through the windows, that Caleb brought up the subject that had been waiting in the background of all their planning. I want to expand the ranch, he said, echoing the conversation they'd had weeks ago on the porch. Add sheep, hire permanent hands, maybe buy some of the adjacent land that's coming up for sale as people leave Silveridge. But Eliza, I need you to understand, this is our ranch now, not mine, ours, which means I won't make decisions like that without your input and agreement. Eliza set down her fork, moved by both the declaration and the sincerity behind it. What do you think we should do? She asked. I think we should build, Caleb said. I think we should plan for growth instead of just maintenance. I think we should create something that will last beyond us, something we can pass on someday to children if we're blessed with them. Children. The word hung in the air between them, full of hope and possibility. Eliza had thought those dreams died with Thomas, but here was Caleb offering them back to her, offering a future that held more than just survival. Then let's build, Eliza said firmly. Let's hire the hands you need. Let's buy the land. Let's create something that lasts. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing over the gold band he'd placed there the day before. Partners? He asked. Partners, Eliza confirmed. In everything. And sitting there in the kitchen of the house that had become her home, with her husband's hand warm in hers and the future spreading out before them like the endless frontier sky, Eliza understood that she'd been given something rarer than gold or silver. She'd been given a second chance at life, at love, at building something meaningful from the ashes of what had been lost. The pennies she'd been short that day in Harrison's store had seemed like the final proof of her failure, the measurement of how far she'd fallen. But it had actually been the beginning of everything, the moment when Caleb Reed had seen her struggling and chosen to help, setting in motion a transformation that had brought her from desperation to joy, from loneliness to partnership, from barely surviving to truly living. And if that wasn't a kind of miracle, Eliza didn't know what was. The expansion began in earnest that summer. Caleb hired 2 steady hands, Tom Miller, a quiet man in his 40s who'd worked ranches most of his life, and a younger fellow named Jack Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, who'd come west looking for opportunity. They built a bunkhouse near the barn, simple but sturdy, and Eliza made sure it had proper beds and clean linens, treating the hired men with the same dignity Caleb had shown her. The work was hard, and the days were long, but there was joy in it too. Eliza watched their small operation grow into something more substantial, watched Caleb's vision take shape in new fences and expanded pastures, and the bleating of sheep joining the lowing of cattle. She kept the books, managed the household accounts with a shrewd eye that surprised even her, and discovered she had a head for business that had never been tested before. You're better at this than I am, Caleb admitted one evening, watching her tally figures in the ledger. I can work the land and manage the animals, but all these numbers make my head spin. Then it's fortunate you married someone who enjoys making sense of chaos, Eliza said, not looking up from her careful columns. We're doing well, Caleb, better than well. If the prices hold through fall, we'll turn a real profit this year. Our first profit, Caleb said, coming to stand behind her chair. Seems fitting, somehow, building something new together. Eliza leaned back against him, letting herself savor the simple comfort of his presence. Do you ever regret it? She asked quietly. Marrying me so quickly? Taking on a partner when you'd been managing alone for so long? Never, Caleb said without hesitation. Not once, do you? No, Eliza said, and meant it with her whole heart. Though I'll admit I'm still getting used to the idea that this is real, that I'm not going to wake up back in that boarding house room, alone and hungry and hopeless. You're never going to be any of those things again, Caleb said firmly. I promise you that, Eliza. Whatever comes, we'll face it together, and you'll never have to worry about where your next meal is coming from or whether you have a place to call home." The words should have sounded like empty reassurance, but coming from Caleb, they carried the weight of absolute certainty. He was a man who kept his promises, who followed through on what he said, who built his life on foundations of integrity and hard work. As summer deepened into the long, hot days of August, Eliza began to notice changes in herself. She woke feeling queasy, had to excuse herself from breakfast preparation more than once to be sick, found herself exhausted by midday despite getting plenty of rest. At first she attributed it to the heat or perhaps something she'd eaten, but as the symptoms persisted, a different possibility began to take shape. She was pregnant. The realization came to her one morning as she stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter while a wave of nausea passed. She'd been married to Thomas for 2 years without conceiving, had begun to think perhaps children weren't meant to be part of her story. But here she was, just 4 months married to Caleb, and her body was announcing a new life growing within. Eliza didn't tell him right away. She wanted to be certain, wanted to wait until the signs were unmistakable. But Caleb noticed the changes anyway, noticed the way she avoided certain foods, the pallor of her face some mornings, the way she excused herself from the dinner table with increasing frequency. "Eliza," he said one evening, catching her hand as she rose from the table. "Are you ill? Should I send for the doctor?" "I'm not ill," Eliza said, and couldn't quite keep the smile from her face despite the nausea still roiling in her stomach. "At least, not in the way you mean." "Well," Caleb's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You're—" "Yes," Eliza confirmed. "I'm fairly certain. I was going to wait a bit longer to tell you, but you've always been too observant for your own good." The joy that transformed Caleb's face was something Eliza would remember for the rest of her life. He pulled her into his arms, careful and gentle, as if she might break from too tight an embrace. "A baby," he breathed against her hair. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Eliza asked, though she could feel his answer in the way he held her, in the tremor in his voice. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Caleb said. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Eliza, I never thought I'd get this chance again. After Margaret died, I thought that dream died with her." "I know," Eliza said softly. "I felt the same way after Thomas. But here we are, being given another chance at everything." They stood together in the kitchen as evening shadows lengthened, holding each other and marveling at the miracle of new life, of second chances, of love that had grown from the smallest seed of kindness into something capable of creating the future. The pregnancy progressed through the fall months, and Eliza found herself grateful for the timing. The worst of the morning sickness passed as the weather cooled, and by the time winter arrived, she was feeling strong again, just carrying the visible evidence of the child growing within her. Caleb treated her like precious glass, constantly worried she was doing too much, working too hard, putting herself at risk. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Eliza finally said one afternoon when he tried to stop her from carrying a basket of laundry. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time while still managing their households. I'm not going to break." "I know," Caleb said, but he took the basket anyway. "Humor me, though. I just want you safe. Both of you safe." His protectiveness was endearing even when it was frustrating, and Eliza found herself falling in love with him all over again as she watched him prepare for fatherhood. He built a cradle from smooth pine, spending hours sanding and finishing it until there wasn't a single rough edge that might scratch tender skin. He insisted on hiring a woman from a neighboring ranch to help Eliza with the heavy work as her pregnancy advanced. He read everything he could find about childbirth and infant care, determined to be prepared for whatever came. Mrs. Chen visited regularly through the winter, bringing gifts for the baby and practical advice for Eliza. She'd delivered countless children in her years as a midwife, and her calm competence eased many of Eliza's fears about the ordeal ahead. "Birth is hard work," Mrs. Chen said bluntly during one visit. "It will hurt, and there's no sense pretending otherwise. But women are strong, Eliza. Stronger than men give us credit for. Your body knows what to do. You just have to trust it." "What if something goes wrong?" Eliza asked quietly, voicing the fear that kept her awake some nights. "What if I'm like Margaret, and I don't—" "Don't borrow trouble," Mrs. Chen interrupted firmly. "Margaret was ill before she ever got pregnant. Her body was weak from pneumonia. "You're healthy and strong, and I'll be here when your time comes, and I know what I'm doing. You'll be fine." The certainty in her voice helped, though Eliza still found herself praying sometimes in the quiet of early morning, asking whatever powers might be listening to see her and the baby safely through. Spring arrived with its usual drama of melting snow and sudden storms, and Eliza grew larger and more uncomfortable as her due date approached. She could no longer see her own feet, had to ask Caleb to help her with her boots, felt the baby moving constantly inside her with kicks and rolls that were both wonderful and occasionally painful. "Active little thing," Caleb observed one evening, his hand spread across Eliza's swollen belly, feeling the baby shift and turn. "Takes after you, I think." "Or takes after you," Eliza countered. "You're the one who can't sit still for 5 minutes." "Fair point," Caleb conceded. He leaned down and spoke directly to Eliza's belly. "Hear that, little one? Your mother's already got you figured out." Eliza laughed, running her fingers through Caleb's hair as he rested his head against her stomach, listening to the mysterious sounds of the life they'd created together. Moments like these, quiet and intimate and full of anticipation, made all the discomfort worth enduring. The baby came on a warm May morning, arriving 3 weeks earlier than expected and with considerably more drama than Eliza had hoped for. She woke before dawn with pains that she initially dismissed as false labor, but within an hour it became clear this was the real thing. Caleb sent Tom riding for Mrs. Chen while he stayed with Eliza, trying to hide his panic and doing a terrible job of it. "You need to breathe," Eliza gasped between contractions, seeing his pale face. "Caleb, I need you calm. I need you here with me, not falling apart." "I'm calm," Caleb lied, but he took her hand and squeezed it, and when the next contraction hit, he breathed with her, counting through it the way Mrs. Chen had instructed during her visits. Mrs. Chen arrived within 2 hours, took one look at the situation, and immediately began issuing orders. She sent Caleb to boil water and gather clean linens, more to give him something to do than because she needed his help. Then she examined Eliza with practiced efficiency. "You're doing well," she announced, "but this baby's in a hurry. It'll be soon." Soon turned out to be another 4 hours of hard labor, 4 hours of pain that eclipsed anything Eliza had imagined, 4 hours of work that pushed her to the absolute limit of her endurance. Caleb stayed with her through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement when she was certain she couldn't go on. "You can do this," he kept saying. "You're the strongest person I know, Eliza. You survived everything life threw at you. You can survive this." And somehow, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Eliza did survive it. She pushed when Mrs. Chen told her to push, breathed when instructed to breathe, and finally, heard the sharp cry of a newborn baby filling the room. "A girl, Mrs. Chen announced, holding up a tiny red-faced infant covered in blood and fluid and screaming with impressive volume. "A healthy baby girl." Eliza fell back against the pillows, exhausted beyond measure, but flooded with relief and joy so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Mrs. Chen quickly cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a soft blanket, then placed the tiny bundle in Eliza's arms. The baby quieted immediately at her mother's touch, her unfocused eyes trying to make sense of the bright world she'd just entered. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a cap of dark hair that looked like it might curl as it grew, and Caleb's nose, unmistakably. "Hello, little one," Eliza whispered, touching the impossibly soft skin of her daughter's cheek. "Welcome to the world." Caleb stood beside the bed looking absolutely thunderstruck, staring at the baby with an expression of wonder and terror in equal measure. "Would you like to hold your daughter?" Eliza asked gently. "I don't know how," Caleb admitted. "What if I drop her? What if I hold her wrong?" "You won't drop her," Mrs. Chen said briskly, helping him settle into the chair beside the bed. "Support her head like this, keep her close to your chest, and relax. Babies can sense tension." Caleb took his daughter with the kind of extreme caution usually reserved for handling explosives, but once she was safely in his arms, something softened in his face. He looked down at the tiny person he'd helped create, and Eliza watched him fall completely in love. "She's so small," he marveled. "So perfect." "Eliza, we made a person. An entire person." "We did," Eliza agreed, smiling despite her exhaustion. "What should we name her?" They'd discussed names during the pregnancy, but hadn't settled on anything definitive. Now, looking at their daughter's peaceful face as she dozed in Caleb's arms, Eliza knew exactly what felt right. "Hope," she said. "I'd like to name her Hope." Caleb looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Hope?" he repeated. "Because she represents everything we hoped for." "Because she represents everything we didn't dare hope for," Eliza corrected. "Everything we thought we'd lost when we lost our first spouses. Everything we found when we found each other." "Hope Reed," Caleb said, testing the name. He looked down at the baby again. "I like it. I like it very much." Mrs. Chen finished tidying up the room and checking on Eliza's condition, pronouncing both mother and baby healthy and strong. "I'll stay the night," she announced. "Make sure there are no complications. But you did well, Eliza. Better than well. You're a natural at this." "I don't feel natural at anything right now," Eliza admitted. "I feel like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle." "That's normal," Mrs. Chen said with a rare smile. "Get some rest. The baby will be hungry again soon, and you'll need your strength." Over the following weeks, Eliza discovered that nothing could have truly prepared her for the reality of motherhood. The love she felt for Hope was instant and overwhelming, a fierce protective instinct that surged through her every time she looked at her daughter's tiny face. But the work was also relentless, feeding every few hours around the clock, changing countless diapers, soothing a crying infant when nothing seemed to help, all while recovering from the trauma of birth. Caleb helped as much as he could, walking the floor with Hope in the middle of the night when Eliza was too exhausted to move, changing diapers with grim determination despite his initial squeamishness, learning to swaddle and soothe and recognize the different types of cries that meant hungry versus tired versus uncomfortable. "I had no idea babies required this much work," he said one night, bouncing Hope gently as she fussed. "How does anyone survive this?" "One day at a time," Eliza said, watching him from the bed. "Same as we've survived everything else." But despite the exhaustion and the occasional overwhelming moments, Eliza found herself happier than she'd ever been. Watching Caleb with their daughter, seeing his large, work-roughened hands cradle her tiny body with such infinite gentleness, hearing him sing off-key lullabies in the middle of the night, seeing the way his whole face lit up when Hope smiled her first real smile, filled something in Eliza's heart she hadn't even known was empty. This was what she'd been meant for, she realized. Not just survival, not just getting through each day, but this. Building a family, creating a home, loving and being loved in return. As Hope grew from a newborn into an infant with personality and preferences, the ranch continued to prosper. The expansion Caleb and Eliza had planned paid off in increased profits, and they were able to hire additional help, buy more land, invest in improvements that made the operation more efficient and sustainable. Eliza discovered she had a talent for managing people and resources, for seeing opportunities that Caleb's more conservative approach might have missed. She suggested they start selling eggs and butter to the remaining families in Silveridge, then expanded that into offering fresh vegetables from their now substantial garden. The extra income was modest but steady, and it gave Eliza a sense of contributing to the ranch's success beyond just keeping the household running. "You're building an empire," Caleb teased one evening, reviewing the books with her. "Started with a loaf of bread, and now you're running a whole business." "Not an empire," Eliza corrected. "Just making use of what we have. There's no sense letting good eggs or vegetables go to waste when people are willing to pay for them." "My practical wife," Caleb said affectionately. "What would I do without you?" "Muddle through, probably," Eliza said, but she smiled as she said it. "Though I like to think I make the muddling a bit easier." "You make everything easier," Caleb said seriously. "Everything better. I look at what we've built, this ranch, our business, our daughter, our life together, and I can't believe I get to have all of this. That you chose me." "I could say the same," Eliza replied. "You gave me back my life, Caleb. More than that, you gave me a better life than I ever imagined possible. You saw me when I was invisible. You helped when you didn't have to. You loved me when I'd forgotten how to love myself." They sat together in the quiet evening, Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby, and reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that moment in Harrison's store to this, a family, a home, A partnership built on mutual respect and hard-earned trust. Do you ever think about that day? Caleb asked. The penny at the counter? Sometimes, Eliza admitted. I think about how close I came to giving up entirely. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't seen me struggling, if you hadn't cared enough to help, I don't know where I'd be now. Probably not here. Probably not anywhere good. But I was there, Caleb said firmly, and I did see you. And I'll always be grateful that I walked into that store at exactly the right moment to meet the woman who would become my wife, my partner, the mother of my child. Fate, Eliza suggested. Maybe, Caleb said. Or maybe just luck. Or maybe something bigger than either of us, making sure we found each other when we both needed finding. Hope stirred in her sleep, making the small sounds that meant she'd wake soon and need feeding. Eliza rose to tend to her, lifting their daughter with the practiced ease that came from weeks of repetition. As she settled into the rocking chair Caleb had made, Hope latching on to Nurse with greedy determination, Eliza felt a wave of contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. This was her life now. Not the life she'd planned when she married Thomas, not the life she'd imagined as a young woman with dreams of adventure and romance, but a better life, in ways that mattered more than adventure or romance ever could. A life built on partnership and respect. A life where she was valued not just for what she could do, but for who she was. A life where her voice mattered, her opinions were sought, her contributions were recognized and appreciated. A life where love wasn't just a feeling, but a series of actions, a daily choice to honor and cherish and support each other through whatever came. As summer deepened and Hope reached her 3-month milestone, the ranch welcomed visitors who would prove significant to their future. The Thompson family arrived one Sunday afternoon with news that their oldest son, Daniel, had gotten engaged to a young woman from Silver Fork. "We're hoping you'll come to the wedding," Mrs. Thompson said, bouncing Hope gently in her arms while the baby grabbed at her necklace. "It'll be a proper celebration, the first real party we've had since before the hard times started." "We'd be honored to attend," Eliza said, already mentally planning what she'd wear, what gift they'd bring, how to manage bringing an infant to a wedding. But the visit had another purpose too. Mr. Thompson waited until the women were occupied with the baby before pulling Caleb aside for a private conversation. "I'll be direct," he said, his weathered face serious. "I'm thinking about selling the ranch. My son's moving to Silver Fork to be with his new wife. My other boys have no interest in ranching, and I'm getting too old to manage everything myself. Before I put it on the market, I wanted to offer you first chance to buy it." Caleb felt his pulse quicken. The Thompson Ranch bordered his property on 2 sides. Acquiring it would more than double his land holdings, give him control of crucial water sources, and establish him as one of the largest ranchers in the territory. "That's generous of you," Caleb said carefully. "But I'd need to talk to Eliza before making a decision like that. We're partners in this operation." Mr. Thompson nodded approvingly. "Smart man. A good wife's counsel is worth more than gold. Talk it over with her. But Caleb, I'd rather sell to you than some stranger from back east who doesn't know the land or the life. You've got roots here. You'll take care of the place the way it deserves." That night, after Hope was asleep and the house was quiet, Caleb told Eliza about the offer. They sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers spread out before them, calculating what they could afford, what risk they'd be taking, what opportunities they'd be seizing. "It's a lot of money," Eliza said, running her finger down the columns of numbers. "It would take everything we've saved plus a loan from the bank, and it would mean taking on more debt than we've ever carried before." "I know," Caleb said. "It's a risk, a big one. But it's also an opportunity," Eliza continued, her mind already racing ahead to possibilities. "That land has good water, good grass. We could run twice as many cattle as we do now. We could build a real operation, something substantial enough to provide for Hope's future, for whatever other children we might have." "So you think we should do it?" Caleb asked. Eliza looked up from the ledgers, meeting his eyes. "I think we should do what we've always done. Take the chance that's in front of us and work like hell to make it succeed. You took a chance on me when I had nothing to offer but a willingness to work. This feels similar somehow. A leap of faith backed up by determination and effort." "Then we're agreed," Caleb said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "We'll make an offer on the Thompson place." The negotiations took several weeks, but eventually terms were reached that both parties found acceptable. By late summer, the Thompson Ranch officially became part of the Reed Holdings, and Caleb and Eliza found themselves managing an operation that required hiring more hands, building additional outbuildings, and working longer hours than ever before. But they thrived on the challenge. Eliza proved to have a gift for organization and delegation, managing the expanded household and coordinating the workers with efficiency that impressed even the experienced ranch hands. Caleb threw himself into improving the land, fixing years of deferred maintenance, implementing new practices he'd been wanting to try. And through it all, Hope grew and thrived, a happy baby who seemed to take the constant activity and busy household in stride. She was passed between workers who'd become like family, cooed over by Mrs. Chen during her visits, and absolutely adored by both her parents. "She's going to be spoiled," Mrs. Chen observed during one visit, watching Caleb make faces at Hope to elicit her delighted giggles. "Probably," Caleb admitted cheerfully, "but she's also going to know she's loved, that she matters, that she belongs." "The way every child should know," Mrs. Chen said quietly, and Eliza heard in her voice the echo of her own history. The immigrant woman who'd come to America seeking opportunity, who'd built a life through hard work and determination, who understood better than most what it meant to fight for belonging. As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Eliza stood on the porch one evening with Hope on her hip, watching Caleb ride in from the far pasture. The setting sun caught in his hair, turning the silver at his temples to gold, and Eliza felt her heart swell with a love that had only grown deeper with time and shared experience. This man had seen her at her absolute lowest and chosen to lift her up. He'd given her not just assistance but opportunity, not just shelter but partnership, not just affection but profound respect. He'd made her his equal in all things, trusted her judgment, valued her contributions, and loved her with a steadiness that made the passionate romances of storybooks seem shallow by comparison. And in return, Eliza had given him everything she had: her loyalty, her labor, her heart, her body, her trust. She'd helped him transform a solitary existence into a thriving household, had borne his child, had stood beside him through expansion and risk and the daily challenges of building something that would last. They'd taken the broken pieces of their individual lives and forged them into something whole, something beautiful, something worth fighting to preserve and protect. Caleb reached the house and dismounted, his face breaking into a smile when he saw Eliza and Hope waiting for him. He climbed the porch steps and wrapped his arms around both of them, pressing a kiss to Hope's downy head and then to Eliza's lips. "Good day?" Eliza asked. "Better now," Caleb said. "Coming home to you two, that's the best part of any day." And standing there on the porch of the ranch they'd built together, holding their daughter and wrapped in her husband's arms, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that every hardship, every moment of hunger and fear and desperation had been worth enduring to arrive at this perfect moment of peace. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. Hope grew from an infant into a curious toddler who followed her father around the ranch on unsteady legs, chattering in her own language and getting into everything she could reach. 2 years after Hope's birth, Eliza delivered a son they named Samuel, and 3 years after that, twin girls they called Rose and Lily arrived with enough energy and volume to shake the rafters. The ranch house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with additions built onto the original structure until it sprawled across the hilltop like a small village unto itself. The operation prospered beyond even Caleb's ambitious plans, becoming known throughout the territory for quality livestock and fair dealing. But success brought its own challenges, and one autumn morning, when Hope was 7 years old, those challenges arrived in the form of a well-dressed man from back east who rode up to the ranch in an expensive buggy, looking distinctly out of place among the dust and cattle. "Mr. Reed?" the man called, dismounting with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to physical activity. "My name is Charles Whitmore. I represent a consortium of investors interested in acquiring prime ranch land in this territory. I'd like to discuss the possibility of purchasing your property." Caleb, who'd been helping Tom repair a section of fence, set down his tools and approached with his usual unhurried stride. "Property's not for sale, Mr. Whitmore, but I appreciate the interest." "I think you should hear my offer before declining," Whitmore said, pulling a leather case from his buggy. "My clients are prepared to be very generous. We're talking about enough money to set you up comfortably for the rest of your life. You could move to San Francisco, Denver, anywhere you wanted, Live like a gentleman instead of breaking your back out here in the dust. I like the dust, Caleb said mildly, and I'm not interested in living like a gentleman. This land is my life's work, Mr. Whitmore. It's not for sale at any price. Whitmore's smile thinned. Perhaps you should discuss it with your wife before making such a hasty decision. Women often have a more practical view of these matters. It was the wrong thing to say. Caleb's expression went cold in a way that made even the experienced ranch hands nearby take a step back. My wife and I make our decisions together, Caleb said quietly, and I guarantee you she'll say the same thing I'm saying. This ranch isn't for sale. Not now, not ever. I'll thank you to leave our property. Whitmore's pleasant facade cracked, revealing something harder underneath. You're making a mistake, Reed. My clients don't take rejection well. There are ways to make stubborn men see reason. Is that a threat? Caleb asked, his voice dangerously soft. It's a warning, Whitmore said, climbing back into his buggy. Think carefully about whether you want to be the man who stands in the way of progress. Progress tends to roll right over people who get in its path. He departed in a cloud of dust, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. Tom approached Caleb with a worried expression. Boss, that sounded like more than just talk. You want me to ride into town, let the sheriff know we might have trouble coming? Do that, Caleb said, his jaw tight. And Tom, make sure all the hands know to keep their eyes open. I don't trust men who make threats dressed up as warnings. That evening, after the children were in bed, Caleb told Eliza about the encounter. She listened with growing concern, her hands stilling on the mending she'd been working on. Do you think he's serious, she asked, about making trouble? I don't know, Caleb admitted. But men like that, men who think everything can be bought, they don't handle rejection well. We need to be careful. The trouble, when it came, was both more subtle and more dangerous than direct confrontation. Over the following weeks, small problems began plaguing the ranch. Fences were cut in the night, allowing cattle to wander onto neighboring land. Water sources were fouled with dead animals. Equipment broke in ways that suggested sabotage rather than normal wear. And then the rumors started. Whispers in town that Caleb Reed was in financial trouble, that he'd overextended himself buying the Thompson place, that the ranch was on the verge of collapse. Suppliers who'd extended credit for years suddenly demanded cash payment. The bank, under pressure from unnamed sources, began making noises about calling in loans early. They're trying to force us out, Eliza said one night, reviewing the accounts with increasing worry. If they can't buy us, they'll ruin us and then buy the land when it goes to auction. Let them try, Caleb said grimly. We've weathered worse than this. But Eliza could see the strain in his face, the worry he tried to hide. They'd built something remarkable, but they'd also taken on substantial debt to do it. If the pressure continued, if suppliers refused to work with them, if the bank called in their loans, they could lose everything. It was Hope, surprisingly, who provided the key to their salvation. Now 7 years old and sharp as a tack, she'd been listening to her parents' worried conversations with the focused attention of a child who understood more than adults gave her credit for. Mama, she said one afternoon while helping Eliza in the garden, why don't you just tell everyone the truth? That you're not in trouble? That the ranch is doing good? That the bad men are lying? Eliza paused in her weeding, struck by the simple wisdom of the question. Why didn't they? They'd been so focused on surviving the attacks, on keeping the ranch running despite the sabotage, that they hadn't thought about fighting back with the truth. You know what, sweetheart? Eliza said, pulling Hope into a quick hug. That's a very smart idea. Thank you. That evening, Eliza proposed a plan to Caleb. Instead of hiding their situation or trying to weather the storm quietly, they would be completely transparent. They'd invite the bank president to review their books personally, show him the evidence of their profitability and stability. They'd hold a gathering at the ranch for all their suppliers and neighbors, let people see firsthand that the operation was thriving. They'd counterlies with truth and trust that honesty would win out over manipulation. It's a risk, Caleb said. Opening our books, letting people see our business. What if it doesn't work? Then we'll have lost nothing we wouldn't lose anyway, Eliza said. But Caleb, we've built something good here, something honest. I have to believe that counts for something, that people will see the truth when it's put in front of them. So they sent out invitations, opened their doors, and laid everything bare. The bank president arrived first, a stern man named Garrison who'd been pressured to call in their loans but had hesitated, knowing the Reeds as honest customers. Eliza sat him down at the kitchen table with her carefully maintained ledgers and walked him through every transaction, every profit, every wise investment. As you can see, Mr. Garrison, we're not only solvent, we're profitable. Our debt-to-asset ratio is better than most ranches in the territory. There's no legitimate reason to call in our loans early. Garrison studied the numbers with increasing interest, his frown gradually transforming into something like approval. Mrs. Reed, these are some of the cleanest books I've ever seen, and you're right. Your financial position is strong, very strong. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Someone's been feeding me information that these numbers prove false. I'd like to know who and why. I can tell you who, Caleb said from the doorway. Man named Charles Whitmore, representing investors who want our land. He came here making offers, then threats, when we refused to sell. Whitmore, Garrison repeated, his expression darkening. I should have known. He's been making the rounds to all the successful ranchers in the territory, trying the same tactics. Offers first, then pressure if they refuse. He stood, offering his hand to Eliza and then to Caleb. You have my word. Your loans are secure, and I'll make sure others know the truth about your situation. The gathering they hosted the following weekend was larger than expected, with neighboring ranchers, suppliers, townspeople, and even some of the remaining residents of Silveridge making the journey to the Reed Ranch. Eliza had prepared a feast with help from the ranch hands' wives, and the house and yard were filled with people eating, talking, and seeing for themselves the prosperity of the operation. Mrs. Chen arrived with her nephew Jack and several other members of the Chinese community who'd built businesses in Silver Fork. She found Eliza in the kitchen, managing the organized chaos of feeding dozens of people. You're making a statement, Mrs. Chen observed, watching Eliza work. We're telling the truth, Eliza corrected. There's a difference. Sometimes the truth is the strongest statement you can make, Mrs. Chen said, especially when others are trafficking in lies. During the gathering, Caleb stood on the porch and addressed the assembled crowd. He spoke plainly about the attempted buyout, about the sabotage and rumors, about the choice he and Eliza had made to fight back with transparency rather than surrender to intimidation. We built this ranch from nothing, he said, Eliza standing beside him with Hope and the younger children nearby. We've done it honestly, paid our debts, dealt fairly with everyone, and we're not going to let threats or lies drive us off our own land. This is our home. This is our children's inheritance, and we'll fight to keep it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighboring ranchers pledged their support, promising to watch for sabotage and report any suspicious activity. Suppliers reaffirmed their business relationships. Even some who'd been influenced by the rumors apologized and promised to set the record straight. But it was Tom Miller, the quiet ranch hand who'd been with them for years, who provided the most valuable intelligence. He approached Caleb after most of the guests had departed, his weathered face serious. Boss, I heard something in town last week about that Whitmore fellow and his investors. Turns out they're planning to bring in sheep operations, big commercial operations that'll overgraze the land, foul the water sources, and drive down cattle prices for everyone in the territory. That's why they want your ranch specifically. You control the best water rights, and you're the biggest operation. If they can get your land, they figure everyone else will fall in line or get squeezed out. Caleb felt cold understanding wash over him. This wasn't just about one ranch or one family. This was about the future of the entire territory, about whether it would be managed sustainably by people who knew and loved the land or exploited for short-term profit by distant investors who saw it as nothing more than a resource to be extracted and abandoned. We need to tell people, Eliza said, having overheard the conversation. The other ranchers, the community, they deserve to know what's really at stake. Over the following weeks, Caleb and Eliza became something they'd never intended to be. Leaders in a community fight to preserve their way of life. They organized meetings, shared information, helped coordinate a united front among the ranchers and landowners of the territory. What Whitmore's investors had seen as a collection of isolated individuals became a cohesive coalition, determined to protect both their land and their future. The pressure on the Reed Ranch didn't disappear overnight, but it diminished as the truth spread and the community rallied. Whitmore himself appeared one final time, his polished facade now completely stripped away to reveal frustrated anger. "You've made powerful enemies, Reed," he said. "My clients don't forget." "Then let them remember this," Caleb said calmly. "This land doesn't belong to your clients, and it never will. It belongs to the people who work it, who love it, who understand that you can't just extract and abandon. Tell your investors they can take their money somewhere else. We're not interested." After Whitmore's departure, Eliza found Caleb standing alone on the porch, staring out at the land they'd fought so hard to keep. She came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. "For now," Caleb said. "Men like that, they move on to easier targets. We made it clear we won't break, and that's enough to send them looking elsewhere." He turned to look at her, his expression softening. "You were incredible through all of this, Eliza. The way you handled Garrison, the way you organized that gathering, the way you kept the household running while everything else was falling apart. I couldn't have done any of it without you." "We're partners," Eliza said simply. "That's what partners do. We face things together." "Partners," Caleb agreed, pulling her close. "In everything." The years continued to unfold with their mixture of challenges and joys. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and interests. Hope proved to have her mother's head for business and her father's love of the land. Samuel was quiet and thoughtful, happiest with the animals. The twins were inseparable tornadoes of energy who kept everyone on their toes. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Eliza's business ventures expanded beyond eggs and vegetables to include a small dairy operation and even a mail-order business for her preserves and baked goods. Caleb continued to improve the land and the herd, implementing sustainable practices that other ranchers began to emulate. But perhaps more importantly, they became known for their generosity and fairness. They never forgot what it felt like to struggle, to need help, to be one penny short of survival. And so they made it a practice to extend the same kind of dignified assistance that had once been extended to Eliza. When families fell on hard times, they found work at the Reed Ranch. When widows needed support, Eliza made sure they had opportunities to earn their own way rather than accepting charity. When the community needed someone to organize relief efforts or coordinate assistance, people turned to the Reeds because they knew help would be offered with respect rather than pity. "You're building a legacy," Mrs. Chen observed one afternoon, watching Eliza train a young widow in bookkeeping skills. "Not just of land and wealth, but of compassion and dignity." "I'm just remembering what it felt like," Eliza said, "and making sure others don't have to feel that way any longer than necessary." The town of Silveridge eventually died completely, its remaining residents drifting away to Silver Fork or other communities with better prospects. Harrison's General Store closed its doors for the final time, and Eliza stood outside the empty building one last time, remembering the day that had changed her life. "Strange to think it all started here," she said to Caleb, who'd accompanied her to witness the end of the town that had once been their home. "Not strange," Caleb said. "Fitting. That penny you were short, that moment of need, it brought us together, changed both our lives. Maybe it needed to happen exactly the way it did." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if someone else had helped me that day?" Eliza asked. "If you hadn't been in that store at that exact moment?" "Every once in a while," Caleb admitted. "But then I remember that I was there. I did help you, and everything that came after, all of it, the good and the hard, it's our story. I wouldn't trade it for anything." They walked back to their wagon hand in hand, leaving the ghost town behind, but carrying its lessons forward. The importance of kindness, the power of dignity, the transformation possible when someone sees another person's worth even in their darkest moment. As the years progressed and the children grew into young adults, the question of succession became increasingly relevant. Hope, now 23 and married to a young man named Daniel, who'd proven himself over several years of working at the ranch, showed every sign of being ready to take over the operation eventually. But Caleb and Eliza weren't ready to retire completely, weren't ready to let go of the life they'd built together. "I was thinking," Caleb said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual they'd maintained for more than 25 years of marriage. "Maybe we should start stepping back a bit. Let Hope and Daniel take on more responsibility. We've earned some rest." "Rest sounds nice," Eliza admitted. But Caleb, what would we do with ourselves if we weren't working the ranch? We could travel, Caleb suggested. See some of the country beyond this territory. Visit that ocean you've always talked about wanting to see. Spend time with the grandchildren. Hope's expecting again, did she tell you? She did, Eliza said, smiling at the news. Our fourth grandchild. It's hard to believe. Hard to believe we're old enough to have 4 grandchildren, Caleb said. Feels like just yesterday you were standing at that counter, 2 pennies short, and I was working up the nerve to help. Best decision you ever made? Eliza teased. Second best, Caleb corrected. Best decision was asking you to marry me. Helping you was just good sense. Any decent person would have done the same. But you didn't just help, Eliza said, turning to face him. You gave me dignity. You made it possible for me to help myself. You saw me as a person worth investing in, not just a charity case to be pitied. That's what made the difference, Caleb. Not the money you spent on bread and bacon, but the respect you showed me when I had nothing left to command respect with. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then reached out to take her hand. You know what I've learned, being married to you all these years? What's that? That kindness isn't weakness. That helping someone doesn't diminish you, it enriches you. That the smallest gestures can have the biggest consequences. He paused, looking out at the land that had been their life's work. I helped you because it was the right thing to do. But you saved me just as much as I saved you, Eliza. You brought life back to this place, to me. You made everything mean something again. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind that came from being understood completely. We saved each other, she said. And then we built something worth saving. They sat together as the sun completed its descent, painting the sky in those spectacular colors that never got old no matter how many times they witnessed them. Around them, the ranch hummed with quiet evening activity, cattle settling for the night, horses nickering in the barn, the distant sound of Hope and Daniel's voices calling the children in for supper. This was the legacy they'd built. Not just land and livestock, not just financial success or community respect, though they'd achieved all of those things. But something more fundamental, a demonstration that kindness mattered, that dignity was worth preserving, that love could grow from the smallest seeds if planted in fertile soil and tended with care. Tell me something, Caleb said, breaking the comfortable silence. If you could go back to that day in the store, knowing everything that would come after, all the hard work, the struggles, the times we weren't sure we'd make it, would you still choose this life? Eliza didn't hesitate. In a heartbeat. Every moment of difficulty, every challenge we faced, every time we had to choose between giving up and pushing forward, all of it was worth it to get here. To have you, to have our children, to have built something that will outlast us both. Even the penny you were short? Caleb asked with a smile. Especially the penny I was short, Eliza said firmly, because that's where it all started. That's the moment that brought us together, and I wouldn't trade the life we've built for all the pennies in the world. As full darkness fell and stars began to emerge across the vast frontier sky, they finally rose from their porch seats and headed inside to the warm light of home. The house they'd expanded over the years was quiet, now that the younger children had grown and moved into their own places, but it still held the echoes of all the love and laughter that had filled it. In the kitchen, Eliza began preparing their evening tea, while Caleb banked the fire for the night. These simple domestic routines, performed thousands of times over decades of marriage, had become a kind of meditation, a wordless conversation of partnership and care. Do you remember what you said to me? Eliza asked suddenly. That day you proposed? I said a lot of things, Caleb replied, coming to stand beside her. Most of them probably foolish. You said you wanted me here because I chose to be, not because you were paying me wages, Eliza said. That's when I knew for certain I was making the right choice. Because you saw me as an equal, as a partner, not as someone you were rescuing. You were never someone who needed rescuing, Caleb said. You just needed someone to recognize your strength when you'd temporarily forgotten it yourself. They carried their tea to the parlor, settling into chairs worn comfortable by years of use. On the mantel sat photographs documenting their life together, their wedding day, Hope as a baby, family portraits taken as the children grew, recent images of grandchildren playing in the ranch yard. We did well, Eliza said, studying those images. Better than well. We built something that will last. We did, Caleb agreed. And the best part is, we did it together. Every step, every decision, every triumph and setback. We faced it as partners. As they prepared for bed that night, following the familiar rhythms of a marriage measured in decades rather than years, Eliza paused to look at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was no longer young. Her hair was more silver than brown, her face lined with the marks of age and experience, her hands roughened by years of work. But her eyes were bright and her spine was straight, and there was a contentment in her expression that the desperate young widow at Harrison's counter would have thought impossible. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, coming up behind her. "I'm thinking about transformation," Eliza said, "about how far we've both come from who we were when we met, about how love doesn't rescue people. It empowers them to rescue themselves." "Profound thoughts for bedtime," Caleb said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Profound thoughts for a profound life," Eliza replied, leaning back against his chest. "We were given a second chance, Caleb. Both of us. After loss, after grief, after believing our best days were behind us, we found each other and we built something beautiful." "The most beautiful thing," Caleb agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "A life chosen daily, together, with intention and love and respect." They climbed into bed, into the comfortable familiarity of shared space and intertwined lives. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods and an owl called from somewhere near the barn. The sounds of home, of safety, of belonging. "Eliza?" Caleb said in the darkness. "Yes?" "Thank you. For choosing me. For building this life with me. For being the answer to every question I didn't know how to ask." "Thank you for seeing me," Eliza replied. "For helping without humiliating. For loving without diminishing. For proving that the smallest act of kindness can change everything." They drifted toward sleep, holding hands beneath the quilts Eliza had sewn over the years, patterns and colors that told the story of their life together in fabric and thread. And in that moment, in the peaceful darkness of their bedroom in the house they'd built together on the land they'd fought to keep, both Caleb and Eliza understood something fundamental about their journey. It had started with a penny. One copper coin, barely worth noticing, the difference between survival and starvation on a cold November day. But that penny had been the seed from which everything else had grown: partnership and love, prosperity and family, legacy and meaning. Because true kindness doesn't diminish when it's given away. It multiplies, spreading outward in ripples that touch more lives than the giver can ever know. The help Caleb had offered Eliza in that store had returned to him tenfold in the form of a partner who'd helped him transform his solitary existence into a thriving home and family. And the dignity Eliza had received had been passed forward to countless others over the years, creating a community built on mutual support rather than charity. From pennies to prosperity, from strangers to soulmates, from survival to legacy. This was the story of Caleb and Eliza Reed, and it was a story that would be told around ranch tables and community gatherings for generations to come. Not as a fairy tale of rescue and romance, but as something better and more true. A demonstration that love grows from respect, that partnerships built on equality endure, and that the greatest transformations often begin with the smallest acts of human decency. The penny Eliza had been short that November day was long gone, spent and forgotten in the endless circulation of commerce. But what it had set in motion would last as long as the land itself, passed down through children and grandchildren who would know the story and understand its lesson. That mercy multiplies, that dignity matters, that kindness compounds into something far greater than the original investment. And that sometimes when you're standing at a counter counting coins you don't have, the greatest blessing isn't receiving what you need. It's receiving it in a way that preserves your humanity and empowers you to become more than you ever imagined possible. This was their legacy. Not just the ranch or the wealth or the successful operation, but the proof that love could grow from the smallest seed, that partnerships could transform lives, that choosing each other daily with intention and respect could create something that would outlast them both. And as they slept peacefully in each other's arms, two people who'd found each other in the ruins and built something extraordinary together, the ranch continued its quiet rhythms around them. Cattle breathing in the pastures, horses shifting in their stalls, the land itself resting beneath the vast frontier stars. A penny had brought them together, but love, respect, partnership, and shared purpose had made them inseparable, and that in the end was the only currency that truly mattered.